Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to American history. And wait, look, up in the sky. It's a bald eagle. No, it's an F-15. No, it's Ronald Reagan, the real life Captain America, come to the rescue to bail out America in her greatest moment of need. That's right. Today we are starting up the story at 1918 when King Ronald the Great emerges from the skies and saves the day in the 1980s. Am I exaggerating a little bit? Just barely. I don't think he actually came from the sky. But other than that, everything's pretty much right. He is the real life Captain America, and I don't. It's just the way it is. So Ronald Reagan, my favorite president, certainly of recent years, certainly since like Washington and Lincoln and all those kinds of guys, but certainly in the 20th and 21st century, he's my favorite. And almost the last good one. I give the Bushes half credit. But anyway, but Reagan emerges in 1980 as the challenger to Jimmy Carter, who, as we last discussed things, Carter was, having a little bit of a rocky go of things. If you remember, in the midst of everything, we had the Iran hostage crisis. We had bad economic stagnation combined with inflation, the so-called stagflation. Carter is not exactly the world's most inspiring leader. At one point, I think I neglected to mention this in the last video, but at one point he made this really famous speech in the White House, in the Oval Office on television, where he wore this just god-awful green sweater vest and talked about how, because of the energy crisis, instead of coming up with some new solution to kind of fix things, he just kind of suggested that everyone should just have their houses down at 60 degrees or whatever. Talked about the malaise that had come across the American people, and just not very inspiring type of language. And then on top of that, mismanaging some of the world situations as well. He revoked recognition of Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, which is going a step beyond what even Nixon did. Some people were thinking he was taking the détente thing too far and being a little too soft on the Soviets. So, 1980, it's time for the Republicans to pick a challenger, and we actually have a pretty competitive race between Ronald Reagan, who was the choice of the more conservative wing of the Republican Party, and George Bush, who was the former director of the CIA, as well as an ambassador to China at one point, as well as the former head of an oil company. I think he'd even been in Congress at one point. I mean, really, George H.W. Bush, who winds up being the next president after Reagan, really had the best resume probably of any president ever going into the job when you look at all the things he'd done. Serving in intelligence, diplomacy, business, the legislative branch, the executive branch as vice president. But anyway, so George H.W. Bush is actually a very impressive figure. He kind of represented the more moderate to liberal wing of the party, but again, I mean, he still would have been to the right of Jimmy Carter. And Carter was the right wing of the Democratic Party, really. So, but anyway, so Reagan, though, becomes the favorite of conservatives. And this was Reagan's third shot at it. He had run against Nixon in 1968, and Nixon kind of won it with name recognition. I think he'd have won if they'd have had like primaries that people could vote, because Reagan connected with the voters in a different way than Nixon did. But and then he ran against Ford in 1976, and really could have unseated Ford for the nomination if Ford didn't have the advantage of being the sitting president. But he tries again in 1980, and this time he succeeds. And he kind of helps to unify the party by actually picking his runner-up Bush as his VP. So then, on the other side of things, Jimmy Carter is having enough trouble, because remember we said at one point in late 1979, right before he has to start gearing up for re-election, Carter's approval ratings fell down below 20%, meaning 4 out of 5 Americans thought he was doing a bad job. And so with that, he actually becomes the second president in a row to face the rare primary challenge. And his primary challenger was a Massachusetts senator by the name of Edward or Ted Kennedy, who was the younger brother of JFK and RFK, and one of the most important congressmen of the period from the late 60s until the early 2000s. He was in there forever. I don't know that he did contribute to a couple key pieces of legislation. Was one of the real workhorses of the liberal movement inside the Democratic Party, and was an absolute scumbag, absolute sleazeball. Alcoholism, womanizing, all that kind of stuff. But the worst thing, and the thing that kept him from winning the nomination, was an incident where he was driving home from a party with a woman who was not his wife, and he wound up running the car off the road and into a pond. She was trapped. He managed to swim free. He tried to rescue her and failed. Then acted really weirdly about it and didn't report. The woman drowned to death somewhere between 11:30 and 1 in the morning. He never reported it until 10 o'clock the next day. So no one knows if there's a window where she could have been saved or not. But even if she couldn't have been, he consulted with his with some lawyer friends in the morning for 6-8 hours before he actually called the cops. It's a really shady situation. That's ultimately going to be the thing that keeps Kennedy, that and just Carter's incumbent advantage. But Kennedy is actually going to get about a third of the vote in the Democratic primary, which is kind of a sign that Carter is not doing that well. So they move into the general election, and Carter faces a tough test from Reagan. Reagan, a little background on Reagan. Reagan had been an actor. We talked about this a little bit in the last video. Then he was actually the head of the Actors Union in Hollywood. He actually was a former Democrat and former liberal who really started to change his views on things in the 1950s. And then by the 1960s, he actually runs for governor of California as a Republican and emerges as one of the real leaders of the conservative movement. By now, there's kind of we talked about a new left in the early 60s. There's kind of a new right emerging in the late 70s. And so the definition of conservatism that really held sway between 1980 and I'd say until 2016, I think the Trump election kind of changed some ways about how the Republican Party thinks about certain issues. But the conservatism of the time period that I grew up in, and kind of the conservatism that I connect with more, it was the era of that 35 or so year period. I guess you could call it Reaganism now, but basically it was a combination of kind of a three-part. It was kind of a bringing together of three different factions into one home electorate. So one was there was an emerging social conservative movement connected with the rise of the religious right in response to stuff like Roe versus Wade, the banning of prayer in schools, all these other kind of signs of decline in support for public morality and so forth. So you have a lot more ministers and people like that getting involved in political debates and political participation. And now I do want to clarify, as I made a comment a couple of videos ago. I think that in some ways, there are elements, at least within the church culture, that have kind of made politics into too much of an idol and that sort of thing, and maybe kind of hurt the reputation of the church by being overly political. But that being said, I think it was actually a very important thing that Christians did start to think about voting in terms of, what would Christ do with this vote in the midst of some of the moral questions that were raging at the time, rather than abdicating their influence. So I think it actually was very important that they got involved, even though I wish, I think there's steps along the way where maybe I'd change this or that, but the fundamental idea of getting people involved in politics at a stronger level in Christianity was a good one. So second, so you got your social conservatives, and then second was your economic conservatives, your real people who are really in favor of deregulation, tax cuts, bringing down the size of the government, and in this, Reagan's policies had a lot of appeal toward libertarians at an economic level. Some true libertarians might disagree with him on the other two aspects of things, but economically very much so. And then the third group were foreign people who favored hawkish foreign policy and a tougher stance against the Soviet Union, kind of the just stronger anti-communists and people that really cared about having a strong national defense, especially with the conception that Carter had, and to a certain extent Ford and Nixon had not projected American strength as much. And connected with this to a certain degree is a group known as the neoconservatives, who sometimes get a bad rap and are kind of a misunderstood phenomenon by some people on the outside, especially after the Iraq War, which they helped push. But the neoconservatives basically were a group of intellectuals who had been former leftists, at least liberals, some of them even Marxists, who had become disillusioned with communism and with liberalism, and started to see the negative effects, especially of the New Left movement of the 60s, and seeing the effects of some of the way that the Great Society programs had failed and kind of had a negative impact on life for the people that they were supposed to help, and so on. So Reagan is able to attract a lot of these like former liberals who are kind of starting to reconsider their positions. And in fact, there's a whole category of voter, most of whom have now kind of migrated over to the Republicans permanently, but at the time they were known as the Reagan Democrats. There was a wide swath of, especially blue-collar voters and stuff. He typically voted Democrat back then that converted to the GOP out of admiration for Reagan. Reagan, because of his background in film, and he was better on TV than anyone has ever been in politics, I think, ever. Which on one hand, I mean, you don't want that to be an overly important thing, but the reality is it plays out like that sometimes, and it helped him win the election because he was able to connect with voters in a way that really resonated. He had this incredible sense of humor. I'll probably pepper the next two lectures here with a few of these random Ronald Reagan stories here and there. My favorite was from the first campaign. Reagan had taken to referring to America as being in a depression once or twice, in his campaign speeches, or there might have been more than once or twice, I don't know, but he was saying that a little bit. And Carter, took exception. It's like, well, a depression is when you have, 8 consecutive quarters of blah, 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 And so in the presidential debate, Reagan says, look, I'm trying to talk in human terms. He's trying to hide behind a dictionary, but if you want a good definition, here it is. He said a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, a depression is when you lose yours, and a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his. Reagan, though, ultimately wins the election. It looks like it's going to be close, and it turns out not to be. Reagan pulls ahead late and wins a pretty convincing margin in the Electoral College. He only won about 51% of the vote. Not that that's bad. I mean, it's still a majority. But Carter's vote total was eaten into a little bit by a strong third-party candidate named John Anderson, who was a liberal Republican who had run for the nomination, representing kind of the left wing of the GOP. And then when Reagan won, he bolted and started his own little thing. Didn't go very far, but he pulled more votes away from Carter than he did from Reagan, despite his past connections with the GOP. So Reagan becomes president, and so now what is he going to do? Well, one thing that happens is on the first day of Reagan's presidency, you do have the hostages return from Iran. Like you said, Carter deserves a lot of credit for that, but a lot of it also was, the sense that, they really did believe that Reagan was serious about using force if need be. And so Reagan's going to do a couple really important things. On domestic policy, he's going to he's going to make some major shifts in economic policies that are going to really lead to one of the longest sustained growth periods in American history after a brief recession in 1982. And then on foreign policy, he is going to step up the level of aggression with which America is fighting the Cold War. He's going to leave behind the era of détente. Not that he's recklessly hawkish and trying to, start wars with the Soviet Union on a whim, right? He favored, nuclear de-escalation and wanted improved relations with the Soviet Union if it was possible, but it would take him until he found a leader, which he would ultimately find in Mikhail Gorbachev the second half of his presidency. He was waiting until he could really find a Soviet leader he could trust to kind of make those steps with, because he wanted to be any types of these negotiations he wanted to do from a position of strength and of them knowing that we're serious. And so part of that is he does build up the American military significantly, large increases in the budget of the military. We're buying more guns, we're buying more tanks, we're buying more planes, we're beefing up our military capabilities, because Reagan believed, and he was a firm believer of the fact that if you have a big enough military, then you won't have to use it. He had the idea that, you're able to avoid fights by being strong enough that no one wants to pick on you. And so that was kind of what he wanted to do with the military. He also, he's the first person to really push back on the... People had, in the 1970s, people had started to take for granted that the Soviet Union would be around forever. Reagan is the first leader to really realize that the Soviet Union is kind of a ticking time bomb because they're built on a system that doesn't work. Communism just doesn't work. And even if you look at, the success that China has had in improving their situation in the last couple of decades, they've improved their situation to the degree that they've left communism behind in their economic system. They're still a totalitarian state with no political freedom and human rights abuses. But they actually how did they start prospering, even though they're supposedly a communist country? By allowing private property and markets back. So, he understood that the Soviet Union as a command economy, it's inevitably going to crash at some point. And he understood some of the pressures that the Soviet Union was under. And so he stepped up a lot of areas of pressure on them that really contribute to their collapse. And the Soviet Union is actually going to fall completely during the presidency of his successor, George Bush Sr., or George H.W. Bush to be proper. But a lot of those things were the results of processes that, a lot of them were Russian domestic things, but others of them were influenced by Reagan's policies. So, it's a little simplistic. A lot of conservatives like to say, Reagan won the Cold War. I mean, it's a little simplistic to say he did it by himself. He didn't wave a magic wand. However, he was a major factor. And if you were to start ranking people who deserve the most credit for ending the Cold War, he would probably be the number one person, even though he was one of many influential figures in that process. So, since I already started talking about foreign policy, I'll jump out of your books and note structure here and do the foreign stuff first, and then we'll come back and look at the domestic stuff. So, strong, so he strengthened the military a lot. And in his first term, he actually uses the military fairly often. It was a peacetime scenario, but, you also, if you were, a serviceman during that time period, you never fought in a full-scale war, but you also certainly were on your toes because you did get assigned to a few different things. One thing One thing that Reagan did was he really stepped up the rhetoric against communism. He started talking about the Soviet Union as an evil empire that would be confined to the ash heap of history, and started using language about like the destruction and collapse of the Soviet Union, which is not the way American presidents certainly had talked in the détente era. There's an extent to which is probably more aggressive than they ever talked about it in the brinksmanship era in terms of rhetoric. Reagan also he proposed something that's called the Reagan Doctrine, which was the idea that we should support any efforts to prevent the spread of communism inside of Latin America. We did not want more Cubas. Cuba did want more Cubas, and the Cubans, along with the Russians, were trying to foment revolution in several Central and South American countries, and Reagan was willing to do whatever he could, short of going to war for the most part. We'll talk about one exception. In terms of covert operations, sending money, sending resources to back anti-communist forces. One civil war that we got involved in that was in El Salvador. We didn't send troops, but we supported the government against communist rebels. Honestly, the government in El Salvador was so wicked that I'm not sure that they were not communist, but they were also just terrible. I'm not even sure if that was the right thing to do or not, because their government was just insane. They had these death squads that would go around, killing people in the opposition parties or whatever. But a much more defensible one that we got involved in was a war in Nicaragua, where the Nicaraguan government had fallen to a communist regime, led a group that was known as the Sandinistas, led by a dictator by the name of Daniel Ortega. And, he was a pretty bad dude, killed a bunch of folks. And, Reagan was involved in, actually the CIA had a role in putting together the main force that emerges to be the opposition to the Sandinista inside of Nicaragua, and that was a group known as the Contras. And remember that name because they're going to be a big player in Monday's lesson. So, so we're doing everything we can to help the Contras in Nicaragua try to overthrow that communist government. One thing that we did militarily that was a smashing success, there's a country called Grenada that's in the Caribbean, small Caribbean island nation. Their government was overthrown by a radical communist regime. Reagan did not like that regime coming into power, thought it could become like a second Castro. And so Reagan actually commits a very small number of U.S. troops, predominantly Marines, to go liberate Grenada. And we actually take out the new government of Grenada in less than a week. We win the war in a week, which is pretty impressive. And so we wind up liberating Grenada from potential communist domination in a very short period of time. Actually, in the Grenada thing, even though it wasn't like a huge engagement, it actually kind of had a little bit of a psychological impact on the American people, because we kind of lost so much belief in our own strength after the way that the Vietnam thing kind of left such a bad taste in people's mouth. The Reagan era kind of restored a certain amount of trust in our military might that we didn't really have as of 1976. We gave money to an anti-communist movement in Angola, in Africa. One thing that we did that wound up being helpful in the short term, but also kind of set up some unfortunate events in the long term, was backing the rebels in Afghanistan who were fighting against the Soviet Union, the group known as the Mujahideen. I can't remember if it's in this group or the world history class because our timelines are starting to get intermingled here a little bit, but I can't remember which class I've talked about the fact that Osama bin Laden actually got his start as a leader within the Mujahideen, and we actually gave him a lot of money and weapons and stuff that then when the war was over, he started to turn them against us, which is actually something of a pattern for American foreign policy in the Middle East, unfortunately. But nonetheless, the support for the Mujahideen ultimately helps prolong the Russian war in Afghanistan, which is kind of their Vietnam, and is really the war in Afghanistan was a major factor in bringing down the Soviet Union. They spent so much money in that invasion, lost so many men, and there was a general loss of support for it, which kind of weakened the whole country. And incidentally, the Russians, there was a thing in your book that I had never heard before, but it was in your textbook, and it blew me away, that they said that the Russians actually, I guess because so many of the, I don't know if because there were so many child soldiers in that war or what, but they actually were actually at times planted toy trucks that were booby trapped with explosions to blow kids' hands off. That's messed up. If that's real, that is messed up. That's bad. That's a bad deal. But anyway, so we supported the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. We do start to deal with a certain amount of terrorism in the 80s. And that's going to be a theme of the next 30 years or so of American history, especially with the rise of Islamic terrorism. There's also some kind of domestic right-wing terrorism issues in the 90s, which we'll get to. But there's several kind of Islamic terror type things that happen that lead to us getting involved in a couple things. Probably Reagan's worst mistake, almost the only mistake he made as president. I can talk about a couple things he did as governor, but as president, he was almost perfect. But one thing that he did that was probably, he said it was his biggest regret, was he sent a bunch of Marines to try to keep peace in Beirut, Lebanon, in the midst of the Lebanese Civil War, which is one of the most fascinating but ridiculously complex situations you'll ever see, because it was basically a civil war being fought between 4 different factions, and some were Shiite, and some were Sunni, and some were Christian, and some were kind of tied to the Israelis, and some were tied to the Americans. I mean, it's a mess. It's really complicated. You don't need to know all of it. But we sent troops in there just to try to help keep the peace, even though we really didn't have a well-defined mission. And an Islamic suicide bomber drives a truck with a truck bomb into the Marine barracks in Lebanon, kills a number of Marines, and forces us to leave in what kind of was an apparent defeat. And so that was a bad deal, both for the loss of life and the loss of prestige. That was probably his worst mistake. There's one thing that happens on the terrorism front, and when terrorist stuff happened, Reagan responded to it very well, typically. But one thing that happened was there was a bombing by the nation of Libya, which was controlled by a pretty brutal dictator by the name of Muammar al-Gaddafi. And Gaddafi masterminded a rocket attack on a commercial airliner headed for Lockerbie, Scotland. And on that plane that was shot down, there were several Americans on there. And so Reagan retaliated by bombing Tripoli, the capital city of Libya, and actually bombed Gaddafi's house. On paper, it's not legal to assassinate foreign leaders, but Reagan went ahead and gave it a shot. And so they literally bombed his personal quarters. He sort of lucked out. He happened to be it was a really big mansion. He was on the other side. Unfortunately for him, he actually lost one of his children instead. So I don't know. If he had a heart, he might have preferred to have been on the other side, but then rather than his son be on the other side. But then if he had a heart, he wouldn't be Gaddafi either. So I don't know. Well, who knows? But anyway, but I mean, that's how serious Reagan was about this stuff. You're going to shoot at our people. We're going to shoot at your house, son. So all of this kind of gives you probably the impression that Reagan was an uber hawk, and that is certainly kind of the image that he has. But like I said, we'll see in the next video, as he moves into his second term, he was doing all that for the sake of being able to establish a legitimate peace and not a compromised peace. And so when he has the opportunity to kind of make some peace in a way that it actually is moving freedom forward, he does it. So that's kind of a little bit of some of the foreign policy stuff that was going on in his first term. On the domestic front, he comes in with a economic policy that was relatively new to recent years. And that is a policy known as supply-side economics, also known as Reaganomics, or its critics like to call it trickle-down economics, which they use that as an insult, but it actually kind of works. That is sort of the idea, is that things do trickle down. So what do I mean by that? So he basically thinks that the best way to grow the economy is to have economic policies that favor the increase of supply, meaning that they increase overall production, and that basically if companies can produce more, that's going to lead to the greatest economic turnaround. So demand side economics, or Keynesianism, which is what was used by Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal and was later picked up by most presidents in this couple decades after him, even Nixon. Keynesianism said if there's an economic problem, the way you fix it is by like putting money on the people that would demand the goods. Putting money, So the idea of the stimulus check, for instance, kind of fits the idea of demand side economics. But demand side economics, lots of government spending, public welfare, all this sort of stuff. Supply side economics says the best thing you can do to grow the economy is cut taxes, especially on businesses, especially on corporations. That's going to inspire investment. Investment is going to lead to expansion of businesses, which is going to lead to higher employment. You'll deal with unemployment, and then the increasing supply is going to help average out some of the inflation. And so Reagan is a believer in this economic policy. There were some skeptics of it even within the Republican Party. His own running mate, George Bush, during the primary when they were running against each other, called Reagan's policies voodoo economics. But the reality is that they worked. Now, they have not always worked every time they've been implemented, but they worked dramatically well in the 1980s. There's and in general, it's good for the economy. In general, it's a good general rule with the economy. When you cut taxes, good things happen. Business gets better when people have less of their money go to the government in taxes. It's just the way things work. And Reagan pushes through a tax cut that breaks JFK's record and becomes, once again, the largest tax cut in American history. There were some people got tax cuts like to the tune of 20% cuts in their tax rate. During Eisenhower's time, not many people paid this, but the top marginal rate, so the marginal rate means like the rate you're taxed on above a certain amount. So everyone pays no taxes on their first so many dollars, and then they pay a certain rate on the next so many dollars, and so each time you bump up a bracket, that's a different marginal rate. The top marginal rate during the 50s was 90%. Now, most of the people that were rich enough to reach that level got around it by putting their money in other ways to get in taxes, capital gains, and different things. But it was 90% on paper. On paper, above a certain dollar value, like the government got to keep $9 of the $10. Well, by the time Reagan's done cutting taxes, the highest tax rate in America, the highest marginal tax rate is like 38 or to 40. So, I mean, dramatic tax cuts. And this causes a explosion of productivity. It frees up so much money for research and development, much of which kind of fuels the tech boom of the following decade. A lot of the advancements that happened in the internet age in the 90s and stuff were set up by the ability of companies to freely invest so much in the 80s. Unemployment goes down. And at one point in the 80s, the tax cut, the government actually started making, now this doesn't work. Republicans sometimes love to think that you can just magically make this happen anytime you want. It doesn't always work like this. It depends on where you are in what economists will call the Laffer curve, but we'll talk about that more next year. But it worked in the 80s that the government cut taxes and got more tax money because they cut the taxes so much that it increased the overall productivity of the economy so much that they got a smaller piece of a much bigger pie. So it's like when I take taxes out of your little bags of chips and pretzels and things, right? Typically, I take a bite or two, right? And let y'all be. But if I said, you know what, if you if you open up a bag of chips in my classroom, I'm going to eat all of your chips except for one. Then the consequence is no one would open the bag of chips in my room because no one would want their chips taken. And so I would never get any chips, right? So I would be getting 100% of zero because no one would open up the bag of chips. But the policy that I allow, I get a small, modest percentage of a decent number of snacks that are opened every day. All right, so it's the same. It's the same concept in a much bigger frame. So they actually increased the income of the government during a couple years in the 80s with lower taxes, which is crazy. Now, I don't want to make it sound like this happened right away because it took a little while. He passes the tax cut in 1980. In 1982, we actually bump up into another recession. Some of this has to do with the actions of Paul Volcker, who was the Federal Reserve Chairman, doing certain things to try to clamp down on inflation, which had been probably the worst economic problem of the 1970s. And what Volcker did actually helped save the American economy. It was a good thing. He deserves really almost as much credit, if not as much credit, really, as Reagan for what happens. But when you try to clamp down on inflation as hard and fast as he was doing, you're gonna cause a temporary setback. And so 1982, they have a recession. Unemployment actually hits 10% at one point. Reagan loses, the Republicans lose seats in Congress, and it looks like Reagan might be on track to maybe not go down as a super popular president. But come 83, you wind up with a situation where the economy starts to grow and starts to grow and starts to grow, and then in 84 it starts to grow and starts to grow and keeps on going, and really continues growing at a continual rate with relatively low inflation all the way until there's a little blip in around 1990 or something, and then that's a little blip, and it's on to really we don't have another major recession after 82. We've got like a little downturn in the early 90s for a year or two. I can't remember if it was 1992. Yeah, it was 92 because it affected Bush's reelection. After 82, we go 10 years basically without another recession, and then we go basically 15 years without another recession. So I mean, the period of the 80s and 90s is like the peak of the American economy in a lot of ways. And Reagan's economic environment has a lot to do with that, both in terms of cutting taxes, but also in terms of deregulation. He believed that over the course of the last several decades that a lot of businesses had too much government regulation put on them that hindered productivity, and he took a lot of those regulations off. One thing that Reagan wanted to do that he didn't get to do enough is cut spending, because the idea was, if you're going to be cutting taxes and raising, so if you're going to cut taxes and you're going to try to increase the military budget and defense budget so significantly, then on paper, what you have to do is cut the domestic budget significantly. And because the Democrats controlled Congress for most of his time, or at least sometimes he had a split Congress, sometimes it was full Democratic control. Most of his time he had to work alongside a Democratic Speaker of the House by the name of Tip O'Neill. Now, let this be a lesson. This is one thing that people in Washington have missed. Reagan, Reagan was a strong conservative. Tip O'Neill was a strong liberal. They butted heads a lot. But they also were actually close personal friends to a certain, at least to a certain extent, at least, good enough to have a real working relationship. And they were able to actually get some deals done. Like the big Reagan tax cut passes with a lot of Democratic votes because Reagan actually understood how to win people over who weren't even in his party. And nowadays, 20 years later, I guess 30 years now, No, 40 years. Okay, 40 years later. Geez, starting to feel old here. But a few decades later, nowadays, the social pressure is to never cooperate with anyone at all, and as a result, we're never able to get anything done in Washington. So, I mean, Ronald Reagan would routinely, have Democratic congressmen over for, social events and stuff like that to try to win them over and to get their vote on a thing here and there. Maybe not on everything, but on a thing here. Now, some of that is both parties were more moderate in the 80s than they are today. The Republicans moved further to the right, the Democrats moved further to the left. And when I say the Republicans moved to the right, I actually think, on policy, Trump is to the left of Reagan, but as far as the presidency, but I'm talking about the number of moderates inside the Congress. Like, there were still liberal Republicans until the early 2000s. Actually, there's still one or two, Murkowski and Collins, but, you still have some liberal Republicans, and you still had a lot of conservative Democrats, or at least semi-conservative Democrats in the 80s and 90s. So it was a little easier to do bipartisan stuff. But so you get these big tax cuts, but the part of the payoff of having to get that through a Democratic Congress is they just would not allow him to cut the domestic budget the way he wanted to. He wanted to substantially reduce a lot of the federal spending, but it was not going to be able to materialize anywhere near to the degree that he liked to talk about it. And there were some budget cuts that did hit in the 80s that did affect like some of the welfare programs and stuff. You kind of got the belt got tightened on them for a little bit for a year or two here. But for the most part, Congress continued to spend a lot of money. Well, if you're going to be spending a lot of money and cutting a lot of taxes, then one of the things that you're going to run into is you're going to start running budget deficits. And so there is a little bit of a debt and deficit problem connected with the Reagan economy. But again, if you have to choose, like when Reagan came into office, like we were dealing with unemployment and high inflation at the same time, while the deficit wasn't that bad. And then Reagan's able to fix inflation and unemployment simultaneously, which traditional economics would say you have to work on one or the other. The fact that they were able to fix both of those at the same time, you have to make a trade-off at some point. He made the trade-off of running some deficits, and ultimately that was probably the wise thing to do. The debt never got to a point where we couldn't recover. I mean, by the year 2000, the federal government actually had a budget surplus. So it's not like the kind of debt and deficit situation that we have today that we will likely never recover from, to be honest. One other thing I should say about the first Reagan term, and then we'll look at his second stint on Monday. The other major event of Reagan's first term is the fact that he nearly gets assassinated. He actually was shot fairly early on in his presidency by a man named John Hinckley. John Hinckley was an obsessed fan of the actress Jodie Foster, who had starred in a movie called Taxi Driver, which the plot involved a plan to assassinate the president. And so, since Jodie Foster was in that movie about assassinating the president, he thought perhaps that she might fall in love with him if he assassinated the president. And so he tried to. And he very nearly succeeded. He actually... the bullet basically misses Reagan's heart by that much, and he was in very, very real danger. It's actually a miracle that he lived. They rolled him in there. They said Reagan, his famous sense of humor. They said he kind of awoke on his way to being carried into the operating room. And the doctor he was working on was one of the most famous doctors in Washington, but he was a noted liberal donor and stuff. And Reagan said, "I hope you're all Republicans." He says, "We are today, sir." Those were the days. Nowadays it'd be like, "Oh yeah, here's our chance to carve him up a little bit." But so Reagan actually has this near fatal gunshot wound. Like they already. They had to, had to sign some papers to kind of let Bush function as acting president for a day or two while he was recovering because he was having to go under anesthesia and all this stuff. It really was down to the wire whether Reagan was going to live or not. But he does pull through, and one of my favorite stories about Reagan's characters is they said that while he was in the hospital after the assassination, he wasn't getting around very good, and he used the bathroom. He wound up kind of making a mess and spilling some stuff on the floor. And a man walks in and finds the wounded President Reagan on his hands and knees, scrubbing up a mess on the tile. And it's like, oh no, President Reagan, what are you doing? We can get that. He said, no, I made the mess. I'm going to fix it. So, my favorite, one of my favorite Reagan moments ever is Reagan's very first speech that he makes back after kind of returning to the public eye after the shooting. He goes out there and he's got the speech, and I might see if I can find the YouTube clip. I might send it to you if I remember. He goes out there to make the speech, and there's a balloon that pops in the crowd, and when a balloon pops real loud, it's kind of the same sound as a gunshot, just a little quieter, and everyone kind of flinches because of what just happened. And Reagan looks over in the direction of the balloon pop and says, "Ha, missed me." I just love that moment. But anyway, so Reagan survives the last major assassination attempt on a president. There actually have been, every president has had threats or things that people that got arrested before they could do the plot or whatever. But he was the last one to actually take a bullet. There was a pretty serious attempt to kill Bush Sr. after he was president. We might talk about that if we have a chance. But he survived as well and lived to be like 98 or something. So that's going to set up Reagan's run for re-election. In 1984, Reagan runs for re-election. He is challenged by Walter Mondale, who had been Carter's vice president. Walter Mondale is actually one important thing about him in history was he's really kind of considered to be the first kind of modern vice president, meaning the first vice president that actually was given work to do. Up until that point, vice presidents had kind of, John Adams had famously said when he was Washington's, I think it was Adams, one of the early vice presidents, someone asked him what he actually did, and he said, I inquire daily as to the health of the president. Mondale was actually a major figure in the Carter administration, was given policy projects that he was supposed to work on and take care of, and basically was treated almost like a freelance cabinet member that Carter could assign to different tasks. And so, and that actually kind of becomes the model for what the vice presidency has become since. So Mondale gets the Democratic nomination. He also makes a little bit of a splash by nominating a woman named Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, who was the first female vice presidential candidate. And Mondale, though, was about as uninspiring a candidate as is humanly possible. If you go listen to him make a speech, it is just a horrible, horrible thing to hear. He also ran on a platform of raising taxes. And after the election, after he loses, Saturday Night Live does this famous sketch where they interview Walter Mondale after the fact, and the announcer's like, "Sir, for decades, every politician who's ever lived has run on cutting taxes. You, sir, ran on raising taxes. Might I ask, what were you thinking?" And in this goofy, Minnesota accent, he says, "I don't know." It's fantastic. But Reagan beats Mondale down so bad that Reagan wins 49 of the 50 states. The only state to vote for Mondale was his home state, which was either Minnesota or Michigan, one of those cold states. I don't know. But whichever, I want to say maybe it was Minnesota. But other than Mondale's hometown, Reagan won every other state, 49 states. I'm going to go on the record and bet that will never, ever, ever happen again. So, one more story. I see I'm running low on time here, so we'll pick up the rest of Reagan's time on Monday. But one more little Reagan story before we go. So, during the Mondale speech, Reagan was actually pretty old by the time he became president. He actually was the oldest, when he won re-election, he's the oldest president that we'd ever elected. Now, he's going to lose that record this year, no matter whether Trump or Biden wins it. Either one of them is going to break that record this year. But at that time, he was going to be the oldest president ever voted on. And so someone asked him in the debate, and this is starting to get some traction in the race. Someone asked him in the presidential debate. He said, "President Reagan, what do you say about those people who think that your age is disconcerting factor. And Reagan famously says, one of the great debate lines of all time, he says, I don't want to make age a major issue in this campaign. I do not want to, for political purposes, to exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience. And after he said that, like, the issue is kind of settled. So Reagan was kind of the master of the one-liner, as well as, being the master of being president as well. So with that, we will pick things back up on Monday with more tales of the Great One. All right, take care.